Hi, everybody. Welcome to One Bookshelf Lunch Break. We have a very special segment today, and I'm super excited to get into it. This is our first segment of what is called History Check, which we will go into. But first, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Eddy. Could you say hello to the people hanging out
Yes,
with
I
us?
can.
May you? May you?
Yes. Hello, everybody. When I'm not being a jerk, my name is Eddy Webb. Actually, no, it's not fair. I'm also called Eddy Webb, but I am being a jerk. But I am one of the in-house developers at Onyx Path Publishing, and I'm also the owner and sole proprietor of Pugsteady.
Awesome. Eddy and I have been peers and friends for a very, very long time, over a decade.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, it's been a long time. And he brought this up because it's such a great thing. We spend so much time talking about how different things happen in the industry in our history, and we
Mhm.
usually highlight kind of like the top, 5 books, or 5 lines usually of a decade.
Yeah.
And I definitely wanted to give a quick shout out to we have Designers and Dragons, which
Hmm.
kind of goes over this 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, available for digital and POD. And a lot of it covers so many important details. But Eddy brought up, what about some of the other games that didn't get mentioned?
Hmm.
And this is no slight on Designers and Dragons, because if they did do everything that was mentioned, it would be
It would be
toast.
massive.
No, yeah, and so we wanted to take time to do that today. So yeah, this is going to be a little segment that we're going to kind of go over, where Eddy picks a title and we kind of deep dive into it. Oh, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Meredith Gerber. I'm the Century Publisher Relations Representative at DriveThruRPG. And we, like I said, are here with Eddy, and also props to Lysa, who is moderating, and
Yay.
also, yeah, is our tech support. So thank you, Lysa. You're the best.
You are the best.
Yes, very much so. So how this is going to work is, this is kind of an interview style.
Hmm.
Eddy has done the deep dive, where I've done like a little bit of a dive, not so much as Eddy. So I'll be asking him questions. Today we are covering Bunnies and Burrows, which is
Yes.
very exciting.
From 1976.
1976. So Eddy, what was the industry like in 1976?
So for context, I was 2, but I have talked to people who've gamed in the 70s, and also, like you mentioned, Designers and Dragons does a really good job of talking about kind of some of the contextual stuff going on. In fact, at the end of each of those books, is a 10 things you might not know about role playing games in each decade, and some that are going to be relevant for today are. Role-playing games still very near its wargaming roots, especially in '76. It's only been 2 years after Chainmail and Dungeons& and Dragons have been released. Games were still very competitive because, again, they're close to those wargaming roots, so the idea that you can't win in tabletop RPG actually wasn't really codified by this point in time. People genuinely thought they could actually win and were encouraged to compete against each other during the course of the game. D&D was the de facto standard, which is something that goes in and out of vogue over the decades. I think we'll talk about that as we go on with this series. But for the '70s, role-playing games are pretty much D&D. And also, the other big one was that because it was so new, companies weren't entirely sure what to publish. Like, even TSR at the time was a tactical company, and the company that publishes Bunnies and Burrows. I'm not going to screw it up all the time. But it's a Fantasy Games Unlimited, and they were still mainly a war game publisher. So those are all kind of factors to think about, particularly Bunnies and Burrows, but there are other things about it as well. It's very nascent. It's very fluid. People aren't entirely sure what this is, and in fact, a lot of people still see it as part of wargaming. It hasn't quite completely broken off to become its own piece of the industry. So yeah, this in '76, it's definitely an interesting time because the concept has formed and people are recognizing it and people are iterating on it, but it's not quite gelled.
Awesome. Very cool. Um, Thank you so much, Eddie at Age 2, for that information. We really appreciate it. um, so you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what titles were well known in the late 1970s?
Let's see. Dungeons and Dragons obviously was like, like the big one. Tunnels and Trolls was another one that was the second ever fantasy game, and actually the one that uh, I think it's safe to say stayed in its own iteration the longest, because D&D went through some pretty significant changes, and also stayed with the same company for the longest. So Tunnels and Trolls is another big one. Maybe we'll get around to it, but still, I think it's relatively well known. Villains and Vigilantes was pretty popular, I believe, at the time. Um, but most of the games really were either a thing that was explicitly D&D or supporting D&D, a thing that was implicitly supporting D&D, or a thing that was a knockoff or derivation of D&D. There are some unusual middle ground things like Empire of the Metal Throne. It was something that was very much inspired by D&D, still very much a fantasy game, but had a stronger science fantasy component, which was actually pretty big in the 70s still. The idea that there wasn't really a hard line between science fiction and fantasy. It was, of course you can crash a spaceship into this fantasy world kind of overlap. And Empire of the Petal Throne was a game that played with that space, but again, still at the core of it, it's still a very Dungeons and Dragons like experience, which is one of the reasons why I thought this game was particular to look at, because I believe it is the first moderately well known, still extant tabletop game that starts to make an actual hardcore deviation from a fantasy or D&D like experience.
Very cool. The next question, I'm going to kind of combine two questions because I think
Mhm.
they're going to answer themselves, which is, what is Bunnies and Burrows, and who are Fantasy Games Unlimited?
Fantasy Games Unlimited, let's start with them. It's a company created by Scott Bizarre. Um, I believe I'm pronouncing it right, Bizar. And he was definitely part of the mentioned second generation of entrepreneurs. And much like the industry today, to be honest, a lot of entrepreneurs were themselves hobbyists. I mean, I think that's pretty common throughout our industry. As a new companies forms, it's the, oh, I love doing this. I think I could do this better. Let me go ahead and take a stab at that. Um, Mr. Bizarre was actually pretty down on D&D at the time. There's a great quote from Different Worlds Magazine, issue 5 from October of 1979, where he says, quote, "With wizards not carrying swords and buying spells with gold in some kind of supermarket of magic and the simplistic combat system, we could not balance D&D with our knowledge of fantasy and the fantasy tradition," unquote. So right out of the gate, he was like very much the, I'm going to form my own company and do my own thing. He created Fantasy Games Limited. Some of his first products were, again, war games, Royal Armies of the Hyborian Age, which is totally not Conan, I swear, wink, wink, in 1975, and Hugh McGowan's Gladiators in 1975. Eventually would make about 30 war games from 75 to 81 before they shifted focus to role-playing games. What's interesting is Bunnies and Burrows 96 was their first tabletop role-playing game. And it was created by Dennis Sustare and also, I believe I sorry, blanked, Sustare and Scott Robinson. And they both created this. And again, Sustare, similar to Bizarre, did not think fondly about D&D. He was actually very critical of D&D. In Different Worlds issue 1, he said, quote, "If the main difficulty in acquiring a treasure is figuring out how to find it, or how to recognize if you found it, or how to make use of it once you've acquired it, rather than how to kill the guardian of the treasure, then you're basing the game primarily on the ingenuity of the players." He really felt that puzzles, as he called them, should be incorporated into gameplay more than just purely a combat system. So, in a lot of ways, Bunnies and Burrows is, as far as I can tell, the first game that basically was, it really made an attempt to be the anti D&D.
Awesome. Um, It's fascinating too that that's the route that they went, and I'm excited to learn more about Bunnies and Burrows. Um, so, what makes them, aside from they deviated essentially from
Mm.
what was popular, what other aspects makes Bunnies and Burrows special?
Uh, so there's a lot. But
We
so
got
I
time.
think yeah, it's good. We have an hour because I'm part we're doing this. I want to start with some context where this is pretty obviously and at one point actually self-referentially a take on Watership Down, which was it's hard to understand modern culture, but Watership Down was huge around 75, 76. It was part of a wave of a return to fantastical and fantasy novels that were slightly different from the pulp offerings from like the 30s, 40s, and 50s. This was when, for example, Lord of the Rings trilogy became popular again, kind of came back to public awareness. The A lot of hippie subcultures adapted Lord of the Rings terminology and language in the late 60s, early 70s. And then that from there, there's a cascade of people hungry for different kinds of fantasy. And again, we haven't quite codified genre fantasy the way we have now. So the whole concept of fantasy has to have elves and dwarves and magic users and whatnot. That certainly started with Lord of the Rings. That's certainly a huge inspiration for that direction, but it hadn't quite gelled as how we perceive fantasy as a culture just yet. It was getting there. Um, and also, this is right around the time that Star Wars became popular, which is we look at it as a science fiction movie, but it's also in a lot of ways a fantasy. So, Bunnies and Burrows kind of comes into this environment going, we want to do something that's fantastical and interesting, but is and like all goods games that become popular very quickly, usually there's a pop culture touchstone that they can kind of glom onto and say, "Oh, I get what this is." Again, it's the wash it down role playing game. Got it. It's not really though. Um, but the first thing that's really interesting to me about when I read through Bunnies and Burrows as a game is that a lot of other games around this time, I mentioned Tunnels and Trolls, I mentioned Empire of the Petal Throne, very much used Dungeons and Dragons as a systems inspiration. And this game goes in some very different directions. And literally, the first page of text after the contents, in the first paragraph, it says, a currently popular novel has demonstrated that rabbits are suitable subjects for fantasy games, while the biological approach brings a freshness to the style of game now dominated by sword and sorcery orientations. So this is 2 years after D&D launches, and already people are going, "This is just there's too much D&D in this industry." It's like, "We're gonna make a different game." So, uh, uh, some of the things that are on a mechanical level are interesting. It still has characteristics. It still has basically what we call abilities or attributes now, but they're called, primary characteristics. So you have your strength, speed, intelligence, blah, blah. They also have smell as an actual characteristic. Which sets up some interesting context for like this is going to be enough of a thing that happens in the game that actually it needs to have a separate statistic that needs to be tracked. So that's interesting, and especially as someone like myself who's made a animal based game, the idea that smell is its own characteristic is an interesting choice. Um, but in the flip sides, again, this is still relatively new in the industry, so it still has they're all 3d6. You roll 3d6 and you roll them in order, and that's your character, which is very original D&D in a lot of those games. Like you generate your character randomly. You don't really have much choice. Um, Also, how leveling works in Bunnies and Burrows is that each characteristic gains levels. So you as a character don't gain a level, but rather if you keep using your smell very often, then eventually your smell levels up, and that gives you new capacity and new ability. So the more you use an attribute, the more it get levels in it, and you start at certain levels. Um, and each attribute has a profession, a rabbit profession, because rabbits have professions. Why not? And so if your strength is your best characteristic, then you're probably a fighter. If you're speed, you're probably a runner. Uh, Smell is herbalism. which I'll get to in a minute. But that's one of the two interesting things about the system. Wisdom is seer, which is the other kind of mystical component. As you dig in, this game is in the PDF version I got from DriveThruRPG, which was the 1982 reprint of 1976 version. There are 38 PDF pages. This is a very slim game. It is about a little bit smaller than a traditional 70s style RPG, but it's about on that same level. Um, but there's a lot in here, so it's like we get to page 6 and you're already into combat rules. So I mean that's how fast it is. But combat is interesting. So how it works is on some level it is ultimately you have a strength level and you compare it to someone's defense class and that's how you hit. So that is a component of it. But there's also both the person attacking and the person being attacked chooses an attack style. You can bite and hold someone, you can claw them, you can kick them, you can pin them on the ground, whatever. And then at the same time, you reveal which fighting mode they call it you use, and then the intersection of those determines how hard it is to actually hit someone. So if I defending and I just run, a lot of the numbers drop. But if the person who is attacking me has bite and hold, they're holding me down. So it's actually harder for me to run because I'm being held down. Whereas if that person chose claw because I'm running away, it's harder to actually hit me with a claw. But if we're both biting and holding on the ground like this, it's actually relatively easy to each other because we're both trying to do that. So there's almost a martial arts style system in this rabbit game, right? Which is like, that's really unusual. And each fighting mode has different kinds of damage. One interesting point is because again, this is relatively new in the industry. Uh, the game just calls dice, except for critical hits. You actually have to roll a 10-sided die, and that's separately and just to call it 10-sided die. But otherwise, it just says like for damage, it goes 1 die, and then the parentheses 1 to 6 points. So I was like, dice are just dice. They hadn't again really codified we have to identify each kind of die, even what we call normal dice, 6-sided dice, as separate and distinct. It's just, well, they're just dice. But then this is a 10-sided die. Make sure you roll that. So that's an interesting kind of side of it. But so let me get to smells. There's actually a whole. Let me check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages of rules on smelling, which is huge. And so smell does ultimately 2 things. One is it helps you to find edible food, and that's one interesting economy of this game from a design perspective. So for those that aren't designers, what economies are is you want to have the players able to spend things to get other things, and you want that balance to be that they're always spending just enough to feel like they're getting what they want, but never too much and never not enough, right? So hit points are an example of a good economy. You want to feel like you're getting close to near death in a good combat, but never actually die. And occasionally dip below, and occasionally you're fine. But in a good balanced economy, you're taking a decent amount of damage, but never actually quite tipping over to the edge. So it feels exciting and interesting, but never actually killing you. Same thing with things like spending, literal like spending gold to buy things. You want to make sure you have enough gold to buy interesting stuff. Never too much wealth, never not enough wealth. In this case, food is an actual economy where if you eat certain food to survive, but not all food is safe, so you have to actually smell it. There are specifically different locations, like there's a root, stem, a leaf, flower, a nettle. There's 4 different smell types: sweet, sour, acrid, and pungent. And then there are 9 different preparations once you find the food to prepare it. So if you are at a berry and the berry smells sour and it is in clear water, it's probably a lemon berry root. So that it's very, very specific. And then on top of the food cycle, because rabbits are herbivores, each of those herbs can also give you special benefits. So the smell-based character becomes, on some level, kind of like an alchemist. But again, you have to prepare it properly. You have to make sure it's good. You have to make sure it's high quality. So you have to smell it. You have to be smart enough to recognize through your smell whether it is good or bad. You have to prepare it to make sure if it is bad, it's done well, or to give it the maximum benefit. Then you have to know one of, it looks like about 40 different herbs and what each of those are. And so, like, some of it's like fire root. If you chew on it and place it in the sun, it starts a fire for 1 minute. But you have to know all those pieces. So it's a lot of the players just learning and figuring things out. And so part of the game is actually exploring your environment, trying different herbs and seeing what they do. Uh, and there's even a note on this chart. It says the herbs on this list were found to be sufficient for most purposes in extensive game testing. Nevertheless, the game master should try to add a few to keep the players guessing. So they play tested this list, but they also recognize that once players know the list, they're going to be familiar with it. So they actually throw some curveballs in. And there's poison weed, which is sometimes herbs will poison you if you don't actually prepare it correctly or find the right one. So again, this is a decent chunk of the game. The other part is you also have actual psychic abilities. I'm kind of jumping ahead here a little bit, but where are the psychic abilities? Uh, anyway, but you have like you can see things in the future, and if you have certain roles and uh, abilities to actually try to see what's going on, try to figure out what's going to happen in the future, to heal people empathically. They call it empathic healing. So by touching your paws to a damaged rabbit, you absorb the damage into your own body. So there are some design decisions here that uh, were clearly meant to give that more explicitly fantastical elements. Uh, so there are you can also instill fear in someone. You can feign death. You can view the future. And none of these are easy. Like you have to go into a trance for 10 minutes to view the future. And there's a percentage chance of it being misleading. But, then you have trance points to determine how often you can do things. So there's all sorts of rules around this. But, it's rabbits with psychic powers. It, and there's an entire language category. And there's a whole page on just languages. Because how they have ordinal languages, familiar languages, and then specific languages. So, like, there's carnivore as the ordinal language, but then as a carnivore, you can specialize in canine, feline, or musteline, or ursine, and then from there, so like if I speak canine language, speak to dogs, but I could probably also speak to cats and weasels. But because rodents are a different ordin, I can't actually speak to squirrels or rats unless I have the common rodents ordinal language. Just a massive, sprawling way. And as a rabbit, you start off with Lagomorph and Lapine, the rabbit languages. But other than that, you have to learn the other ones. So you can kind of talk to animals, but not really. So there's a lot of things that adds complexity and our level of complexity that some people who are familiar with more popular 70s eras games may not be surprised by. But the complexity is also world building. And so what you have is actually a fairly efficient system. Because yes, you have 2 pages of language rules, but also those language rules tell you a lot about how the world works and what kinds of encounters you're expected to have. Um, the fact that there's 5 pages of herbs, but also it's like this is a big part of the game. A 38-page book, 5 pages is almost 15% of the book. So clearly, this is a big part of the game that they expect you to play in. But also there are presentations that are a little clunky from modern perspectives, but are actually somewhat elegant. They have what they call the Circle of Professions. And the Circle of Professions is that each of the um, 8 professions that I mentioned, you put them into a circle because the game assumes that rabbits are ultimately going to be confronting other rabbits. So you're going to be finding a rival warren and attacking them, or they're going to be attacking you, and you're saving your flock or whatever. So I assume that it's rabbit on rabbit violence, you know, but it's like Pokemon only with rabbits. Uh, and the closer you are on this wheel, the more you can affect each other. So a fighter is diametrically opposite to a herbalist, so they struggle to affect each other more effectively. But a fighter and a runner are relatively close to each other, so they have more of an effect on each other. And this seems to go all through the game. So it's not just like combat. So an herbalist can use their herbs on a fighter more effectively than vice versa. A fighter can attack an herbalist more effectively. But our fighter and a runner in a fight are going to be closer together in combat. So when it comes to, and this is all used for saving throws. So like anytime someone does something against you, it's hard to save against them if you're further apart. The game does not do a great job of explaining this because it's kind of crammed into half a column on one page. But in a modern layout, is having like that kind of like circle like on the character sheet somewhere with like numbers denoting how you would reflect and affect each other. It becomes an interesting metagame of knowing each character's profession and okay, well, there's 2 mavericks and a storyteller in front of us. So you're a seer. You should probably go take out the storyteller, whereas Will, the scout, whoever, maverick. There becomes some tactical discussions that become really interesting potential gameplay, but the designers can't quite see that because they don't. They have 2 years of design experience. They're kind of just going off what they think sounds interesting, as opposed to we can look back on it and go, okay, you can re-architect that into something that potentially is really, really complex gameplay. Again, same with the fighting system. The idea it become a very dynamic fighting system, but it's just laid out as this kind of clunky looking chart. So really, a lot of this is 1976 presentation and limitations they had for self-publishing or limited scale publishing. So yeah,
Thank
there's a lot
you.
here.
Yeah, they say thank you for answering the question, what makes it special? It's a lot of really, it's packed with a lot of information.
Yeah, it is.
And I think it's fascinating. I think the job aspect, I guess, is really
Mhm.
fascinating. Like you said with the runner and the fighter, like I think that's really cool. It's just it's different, but I can see also like where games now like have pulled from this type of aspect and where they pulled from D&D at the time, and other games that were influential. So it's interesting. It's very, very
Yeah,
interesting.
and the one thing that I find really interesting about this game specifically is, if you talk to modern tabletop RPG designers, or even people who are just interested in design, you'll
Yeah.
hear about fluff and crunch, right? Fluff is all the setting material. I don't like these terms, but they are commonly used terms. Fluff is
Yes.
all the setting materials, the fiction, the background, and the crunch is all the mechanics and then the rules and how you engage the
Hmm.
system. There's no distinction in this game. There's not really any setting explicitly presented. It's all woven through the rules.
Hmm.
And the best example is the appendix. Appendix A is labeled gambling rules. So it tells you just that one heading tells you so much. Rabbits gamble, and they gamble enough that there's a rule system for it, and we expect you to gamble enough that we actually have an appendix to make sure you have rules for 2 different gambling games.
Okay. Well,
And so through the game, it's like, it never says, "Why do rabbits gamble?" I don't know, but I'm sorry, I take it back. There are 3 different gambling games in this here. 2 pages of gambling rules. But it's like, at the very end, these are only 3 of the many possible forms of gambling available to player characters. We openly encourage experimentation and innovation of developing new forms. Remember the limitations of your rabbits as you draw them up. So it's like gambling, especially amongst rabbits, is a useful means of arbitration. That is the last sentence of the book aside from an ad for miniatures. Um, and it's just like, by the way, rabbits use gambling for arbitration. But that's shoved in the middle of just a huge chunk of rules.
Mhm.
So there's no differentiation, and that's really interesting to me.
That also makes it very special, because I did not
Mhm,
expect that. I mean, because what you were describing in the beginning were what rabbits do, you know what I mean? Like, sniffing things out and things like that, and this is very, very different, I guess. I didn't expect it, so that was kind of a surprise in that regard. Um, cool. This
yeah, and
is
actually, I'm
neat.
curious, since, you definitely are much more of a visual designer than I am.
Mhm.
I mentioned kind of the limitations of the '70s era design. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on, like, how the book was laid out and the art and
Sure.
how it was presented?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely, I mean, it looks like it's from the 70s, in that
Mhm,
regard. It's got this that style. It's like it's black and white interior. Um, very one note color. They use blue, on their cover, um, which is interesting
mhm,
because I feel like it's effective. I mean, like a lot of books nowadays have like very, very like, big art pieces and things like that, which I think is also effective. But I
mhm,
think that Bunnies and Burrows is effective because it uses that one tone, and like so
yeah,
you know that that's Bunnies and Burrows, like you know it from sight. And they have that 1970s font too,
yeah,
very much so. I will
that kinda
actually,
groovy,
yeah, I'll
yeah,
link to it in the Twitch, and I will also put it on our YouTube as well. Um, and this is, it's just like I said, it's interesting. I just think it's very interesting use. Also, I like the hand drawn stuff. Like I think
okay,
it's really cool. Because it definitely gives it some character, and like it just feels, I don't know, like for me, like I look at this and I can feel like that time era, like in how
mhm,
the design was done, um, without it looking too dated. Like it just,
okay,
it definitely, I think separates it because when you look at books from the 70s, a lot of them are black and white covers, black and
yeah,
white interiors, whereas this one was like, we're going to use one specific color on the cover and like make it essentially, different, which I really appreciate. The other thing too is, I thought to myself when I was looking through this, I mean, it's very much like the two column look,
yeah,
which, as much as people have changed their books, like that's very common, now.
mhm,
People have done all sorts of different types of things, with their layouts, I mean, with bookmarks and all sorts of new cool stuff. But like, at the end of the day, when you get down to it, like a lot of companies still use this model. And I think that's neat that that hasn't really changed, like
mhm,
that has maintained its way through several decades and people are still using that. Um, they also have their little bunny sketches too, which I think are really
yes,
cute. Um, because they're just simple sketches, right? Like they're not like full, like, renders and things like that. Like it is literally like someone sketched it on the page. And I kind of like that because it feels like, for me, like when I play, I'm a person who doodles
mhm,
when I'm, playing, because it helps me focus. And like it looks like something I would draw, like, like just drawing like little characters and stuff. And I like that a lot. I think it's great, and I think it works really well, as opposed to massive drawn pieces, right? Like you have these
right,
little tiny like sketches. Like one of them looks like they, did it with a Sharpie marker, you know what I
mhm.
mean? Like, and it just feels more realistic in that regard. So I like that a lot. I think it's neat. So that's where I am on the design. Is, yes, it is definitely, from the 70s, but like it
Mhm.
has a lot of aspects that I think are really interesting, and like I said, everyone uses, which is great.
And actually, that reminds me, one thing that was so distinctively in the '70s and early '80s in
Hmm.
tabletop games, and they inherited from wargaming, was numbered rule sections.
Hmm.
Because I'm speculating, but I believe that the publishing technology at the time did not allow for easy understanding of what page number a particular rule would land on. So instead, what they would have is, for example, I'll just grab wisdom rules. So wisdom rules are 7.0, and then the subsections, each kind of rule chunk is 7.1,
Hmm.
7.2, 7.3, 7.4. And so if it has a rules references, go see rule 2.2 or go see rule
Hmm.
3.7. And so you can quickly find it in the book without referencing a page number. They didn't have obviously hyperlinks or anything like that.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting way of using what technology limitations they had at the time to find a way, but recognizing that people did need to find specific rules quickly. Their
Hmm.
solution was these numbered sections, but that's not something we've carried on because we found different ways of
Hmm.
doing that. But it's still
Yeah.
an interesting that's still a need that gamers have even in '76.
Yeah, it's just cool. It's like opening up like a time capsule. I love
It
it.
is.
Yeah, so with that, going over all that, what how is Bunnies and Burrows like grown essentially? Adriel, our indie publisher relations representative, they pinged me privately to
Oh,
ask me. I'm interested in hearing about the journey through publishers, if that's within the scope of today's show, and it is.
it
So
is.
we are gonna go over that. Um, so aside from, I have a couple examples here,
Okay.
which Eddie and I will go through. Um, have any titles since Bunnies and Burrows taken the same route and system? I think that's a kind of a double-sided question in that, like, we have these examples where Bunnies and Burrows has been um, reworked essentially
Yeah.
by another publisher. Um, but have you seen people take this system and kind of expand on it over the years?
Um, yeah, I'm hemming and hawing because yes and no. I don't think anyone has directly taken the Bunnies and Burrows systems and applied it to a new property. I
Mhm.
believe, um, but so let me step back a little bit actually. How Fantasy Games Unlimited worked, they had an interesting business model. And in this case, interesting is not necessarily good or bad, it's just interesting. Where people would just pitch games to the owner, and if he liked them, he would publish them. So he didn't really have in-house systems like several. You don't have your GURPS for Steve Jackson games, your storyteller system, your D20 system, whatever. That concept wasn't really a thing at that time. It was more if person A pitched you a game, it was you liked it, you published it. Person B sent you a completely different game, you published it and like it. If person A did 2 or 3 games based on the previous game, you would also publish those if you liked them. So it wasn't like Bunnies and Burrows is the first game, so all of our games have to be derivations of the Bunnies and Burrows systems. They were all just unless someone, Dennis Sestari decided to make a different game using this core, it didn't really exist. So in that front, no. And also, Bunnies and Burrows, to be clear, wasn't really well received when it first came out. It was the only game that came out in '76 by Fantasy Games Unlimited, and a lot of wargamers just did not like it because it was not quote unquote serious enough, which is a whole separate thing. So uh, I could also see why maybe there have been some reticence to double down unnecessarily moving forward with this. On the other hand, there are lots of pieces of this because it's not ultimately at the end of the game day. This system is you have 8 attributes and then you use those and through various charts. So there are lots of games that do variations on that. Again, very late '70s, early '80s design. There are lots of cross-referencing charts. Uh, a lot of those charts are pretty simple, but the design mentality at the time was rather than having players do the math at the table, we'll just give them a chart so they can easily cross-reference a chart was seen to be more effective than doing quick math at a table. That is a design thing that has changed. So things like uh, uh, comparing characters' charisma levels. So it's like, okay, well, my charisma level is 5, yours is 8, so you're going to have a higher percentage chance of doing it. That's pretty common design just in a lot of games. So there's definitely things that I feel like other games have pulled from, if not intentionally, at least maybe from the same. intense. Things like the Circle of Professions. I've seen other games do stuff like that where it's um, depending on how your character is oriented. I mean, Magic the Gathering, the color wheel is very similar to this, right? Right. It's like blue cards in the trump, you know, green cards or red cards in trump, green cards, blue cards, blah blah. All of that kind of interactivity is still common industry. That goes to even the elements interactions of games like Final Fantasy games. The triangle weapon triangle from Fire Emblem. Those are all kind of on some level variations on the Circle of Professions. So there's not a game where it's like powered by Bunnies and Burrows that I'm aware of, but certainly there's a lot of design ideas here that get refined and simplified. Um, that said, I do want to say there are parts of the game that are, let's just be honest, from a modern perspective, are explicitly problematic. You are playing male rabbits. Female rabbits sit in the warren and breed. That is what they do. And you have a dice roll to see how successfully you breed with female rabbits. There's a whole lot to unpack around that section. I can understand why the decision was made, even if I don't agree with it. It's like we're playing animals. This is how animals act. When you start to humanize animals, you have to also take on the fact that you're humanizing the acts they portray. So, and that's something I don't think it quite figured out. So there's some pieces of this that also did not get carried through explicitly. Other games featuring animals did not feature that kind of here's how animals act. So let's try to find a way to gamify that. That got dropped. Sorry, I can't think of any other game that did something like that. Or if they did, they're awful games. We shouldn't ever talk about them. But it's also a relatively small part of this, and it's so easy to just ignore it. I mean, it's really like it's one section of the charisma thing which happens. You just ignore that chunk. Again, one of the nice things nice about this design is that it's kind of intentionally, unintentionally modular. You can kind of just drop things in and out. So there isn't really any other game that directly pulls from this, but I think it's a good view into how design is evolving, even as fast as 2 years after D&D.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of routes to and you mentioned games about animals, which I would like to say that you are an expert on, as you are someone who created Monarchies of Mao and Pugmire. um, and I wanted to ask, it's not on our outline, but I'm curious
It's fine.
as to when you were creating, like with that idea that you stated, like when you were creating animals, like what was your process in that when you're creating Pugmire and Monarchies, and what they do, what cats and dogs do?
So, one of the cheats I used, honestly, with Pugmare's Monarchies Mount is that because these are characters that have been uplifted by man, and I specifically use pets as the playable species in the game, I can take that humanization of characters and make that part of the setting. So it's not like games where it's just they're just like people, but they happen to have animal heads, which some games do. And if you enjoy those games, that's fine. But that's you're basically playing humans that look like animals. Um, Bunnies and Burrows is a game where you're playing animals that act kind of like humans. Uh, I kind of take the middle path, which is that these are dogs that are trying to act like humans, and a lot of their culture is built from the context that they had in their relationship with humans. Same with cats. So it's cats are like, well, humans served us, and they were great servants, but we don't worship them. It's very much how we believe our relationship with cats are. So it's not necessarily actual cat psychology, although I did work some of that into both dogs and cats as well. I mean, I did some of the prey drive stuff. I worked into dog gameplay. Some of the how cat socialization works, I worked into Monarchies of Mao. But a lot of it is the how we perceive them to be, and then if we have technology to stand on hind legs and talk and whatnot, we also have the ability to impose those understandings of their behavior onto them to a degree. So it allowed me to kind of cheat and dodge the question to a degree, because it's not really a game about playing a dog, it's a game about playing pets, and it's a very small but important distinction.
Absolutely. And I have dropped into Twitch, and I will also drop into the YouTube those lines, so you can look and check them out because they are great books. I'm not just
Yay.
saying that because Eddie's here. They're really good books. So also on that note about how Bunnies and Burrows has moved essentially through the industry,
Mhm,
we have it's 2 points. Um, they started in 1976, and then they did the second edition of 1982,
mhm.
and then modified and republished by Steve Jackson Games as an official GURPS supplement in 1992.
Yep.
And then
And
then
then
Frog God Games in 2019 released two books, or excuse me, they in 2017 they released Bunnies and Burrows Light, which is a return to the classic game, and I believe that they got some of the original writers on that too.
oh, nice.
Mhm,
I do know that GURPS, Bunnies and Burrows were done in conjunction with the original creators of the first and second edition. I know that part.
mhm,
I didn't
yeah,
know if they worked with Frog God or not, though.
yeah. I believe so. That's what I'm thinking. I think I'm checking. Um, and the Bunnies and Burrows Light of 2017 is it's exactly what it says it is. It's the light version.
Mhm.
Um, so it's only yeah, the download includes 2 files, a 4-page rules folio, and a printable battle board PDF with 2 locations and game tokens of bunnies and predators. So it's a very stripped down version
Mhm.
that came out in 2017. Um, and then Frog God Games again came out in 2019 with
Right.
third edition, and that's
Mhm.
like an actual book, and that is 225 pages, which is something that we see now in our industry as kind of a normal core book size. Gonna put that in the chat.
Right, but again, what's interesting is, I also did a Wikipedia kind of search because I was curious to
Yeah,
put some modern perspectives on it. Because you're right, there's this weird gap. It's like,
yeah,
it was hot in the '70s for, like, 5 years, and then there's a gap until the '90s where GURPS does it, and there's a gap until Frog God. So
mhm,
it's not exactly a game that, like, has a massive burning continuous fandom. It's more
yeah,
people going, "Oh, I remember I played that when I was, a kid," kind of thing. Um but, I mentioned that in, the '70s, a lot of the, wargaming community based on magazine articles and whatnot, were very kind of down on Bunnies and Burrows. But, there was a 2007 RPGNet review of GURPS and Bunnies and Burrows, and it was also equally like, "What the hell do you do with this game?"
yeah,
Um, so even when we get closer to modern day, it's still a very odd section of our design of the market. It's like, it was an attempt to try to find a new path in tabletop RPGs that really didn't go anywhere. I mean, like, and it's cool that Frog Gods do bring it back into a third edition. I think it's exactly what kind of things that Kickstarter should be used for, right? It's the, here's a chance to see this new game and spruce it up and put some
right,
modern design and stability on it. That stuff is fantastic, and I think it's great.
mhm,
But it's also not a game anyone goes, "This is my favorite role playing game ever."
right,
Usually, um, it's something like, "Oh, let's break this out of the convention, or let's try this once or twice." I'm sure there are people who have had long campaigns of Bunnies and Burrows. I'm not saying they don't exist.
yeah,
I'm saying that a lot of people look at this and go, "I don't know what to do with this because it's just so different from our established way of playing games." And again, even in '74, D&D was the path forward. D&D is still seen by a lot of people as de facto gaming even now. And so to have this kind of odd spur is good for design, and it's good for the industry, and it's good from this historical perspective. Look back and go, here's how early experimentation was happening in our industry,
mhm,
but also recognizing that all experiments work. Some games are going to come out and they're going to be like really beloved passionately by a handful of people, and that's just what that is.
mhm,
And Bunnies and Burrows definitely falls in that category. Like, I really enjoyed reading through this. I really enjoyed looking at this, which is a second edition. Couldn't get to first edition, but I mean, we got the second edition to look through it.
mhm,
And it's a fascinating look into a really interesting attempt to replicate a cool experience. But I also don't know if I would necessarily pick this up and play it at the table, you know?
yeah, exactly. And I think that's kind of the interesting point that we're working with on that is It was cool though, you know what I mean? Like, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely looking into, again, a time capsule and being like, "Holy cats." And I thought, like, when we were researching this, like, I was like, "Okay, that's it." Like, it came out in the '70s and it was never touched again. And so I was really
Mhm.
surprised by that it was picked up twice, that it's very interesting. And I also think it's interesting too that Frog God Games kind of kept to the motif look of
Okay.
Bunnies and Burrows, but they made it more like, obviously they made it colored, and like they made like all sorts of interesting like art choices, but they maintained that look with the, like they're bunnies like type of deal. Like um they didn't make it more complex. Like, they, you know what I mean?
Mm,
They didn't, they kind of kept to that in the art look, as opposed to, like I said, making it more like fantastical type of it, which I think was kind of cool that they kept the spirit of the artwork,
yeah.
which is interesting. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually just now skimming through the preview of third edition, and you're absolutely right. It's definitely much more. There's not a unified art style. It's just kind of just pictures of rabbits and throw them in there kind of thing, which is
Yeah.
very much in the spirit of the original.
Mhm.
But also, I already see like some refinements. Like they have the core 8 traits and smell is still on there, but also like they have mysticism as explicit traits,
Mhm.
so that seers and whatnot can actually have their own
Yeah.
specific trait as opposed to
Yep.
just
Yep. Yep.
intel. I forget what it was. And it's not rolled d8s. It's something. So they definitely applied some modern design practices to this
Mhm.
thing. And of course, it's now a 225-page book because that's the size that we have for core rule books now in
Yeah.
tabletop role playing
Exactly.
games. We can't do a 30. I mean, let me phrase that. There are lots of games that are like small 38-page things, but
Sure.
for a game with a history like this, people expect a certain heft to the text.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, yeah. So it's super interesting. I love it.
So cool. Do you
Yeah.
have any other questions like in the chat or other people are shooting you?
I think everyone is just, it comes with tokens now, Adriel says.
Oh wow, nice.
So that's super interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think everyone really enjoyed listening to you, Eddie, and talking all
Hooray.
about this, which is great. So, um, and right on time too, which is also great. So,
Good
uh,
thing we planned this.
yeah, good thing we planned this. Totally in an outline. Everything's great. Um, what was I gonna say? Oh, yeah. So do you have like any other like closing remarks, or like other like, what was actually, I'll ask you one more question. What
Okay.
was the most interesting thing you learned while you were researching this? Doesn't have to be about the book itself, it can be about the history.
Um, honestly, uh, there's one big thing, one small thing. The big thing was that I went into this thinking, oh, this is probably going to be a game that has like very small following because it's
Mhm.
something I've heard of but never really read.
Yeah.
And I've read a lot of role playing games, and I never read this one before this podcast or research, I should say. Um, and so I was like, I expected there to be like this cult following I just had never heard of, and that didn't happen. I didn't really find any evidence of that.
Mhm.
So I started going, okay, maybe this is a game that just had its 5 years and was done, and we just weirdly keep referencing it. But then to find out that both CVX and Frog Gods brought them out, and each time was like almost 20 years apart each time.
Mhm.
It's that weird kind of excitement, interest. Clearly, there's a group of people who love this and have a competitive to it, but didn't quite find the way to make it a sustainable game. You know,
Yeah.
it's like we did this one GURPS book, we did this one third edition book, and to be fair to Frog God, it's only been a couple of years since third edition came out. So I mean, they may have big plans and find, if they got tokens about that, they're clearly planning to invest in this, which is
Yeah.
great. So maybe they're the company that can make this into a sustainable game.
Mhm.
But even the company that made it only had it for a few years and we're done.
Yeah.
It was interesting to see that it was like I kind of wanted it to have more of a fan following than that,
Yeah.
but also I was entirely not surprised by hearing that.
Yeah.
The other thing was I really loved seeing the kind of proto terminology of them trying to struggle how to articulate things in a way that everyone would understand, but not necessarily lean on Dungeons and Dragons as a way to explain it.
Mhm.
And my favorite has to be how they tried to explain characters that are run by the game master. They're not non-player characters; they're cardboard characters. That's what they're called,
Hmm.
because they're characters that are one-dimensional or two-dimensional,
Interesting.
I should say.
Interesting.
And that's throughout. They're all consistently called cardboard characters. And
Yeah.
for like a while, I was like, what the hell is a cardboard character? And then like way back in 13.4, it's like, here's what cardboard characters are. I'm like, okay, oh, they're NPCs. But they had to actually spend like a paragraph and a half explaining what this concept was. So
Mhm.
little bits like that where it's like we so understand these now, but 2 years after D&D came out, it's like, what do we call these? So there's lots of little bits of this that were just really delightful to see, like different paths where the industry could have gone.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, fantastic. Well, I
So
look
yeah.
forward to your next research, which we won't reveal yet
Okay.
of what our next one is, but uh, we will definitely let people know when that is. I'm pretty excited. So
I'm
it's going to
excited
be
too.
awesome. Yeah. All right. So, Eddy, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for
If
having me.
people want to hang out with you, where can they find you?
Uh, you can find me through my website, which is pugsteady.com. You can also find me on Pugsteady on social media, mostly on Twitter. Also, the Onyx Path Discord is a good place to hang out with me. I spend a lot of time there, particularly in the Onyx Pathcast channel. If you can't tell, I'm a podcaster and I'm used to giving this information on a regular basis. I'm like many worlds, one pathcast. Like, no, wait, no, wrong show.
No, wrong show, wrong show.
But yeah, so Pugsteady is definitely the way to find me. And if you want to check out Realms of Pugmire, Meredith dropped links, which is great. But also you can go to realmsofpugmire.com and it has links to all the Pugmire stuff.
Yes, which is awesome. I wanted to also note, usually we take this time to talk about what is next week, but
Mhm.
this weekend we have Dungeon Con online. It is
Ooh.
sponsored by our own DMs Guild and Goodman Games,
Mhm.
who are wonderful, wonderful clients of ours. You can roll dice at tons of virtual tables, meet your favorite DM Guild creators in the dealer hall, and learn how to jumpstart your own journey into D&D design and more at live stream panels. And I will drop the link into the Twitch channel. I will also put it on the YouTube as well. So that's super exciting. And huge thanks to Lysa for
Yes.
moderating and being our tech wizard. We really appreciate the best behind the scenes support for us. And yeah, and my name is Meredith Gerber. You can find me at usually everywhere at Meredith Gerber, or you'll see me on the DriveThru Discord. So yeah, it's going to be awesome and super excited. Thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next time for your lunch break. Bye,
Okay.
everybody.
Goodbye.